Monument Avenue is ground zero for the memory of the Confederacy after the Civil War.
Change is afoot.
Black Lives Matter!
They are symbols of systemic racism, forgetting the brutality of the slave system.
We are now awake.
Monument Avenue should be a continuum of history.
The problem has been that half of the story has been told.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Audrey Davis, and I'm the director for the Alexandria Black History Museum. Thank you for attending this evening's discussion of the film, How the Monuments Came Down. This presentation is sponsored by the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project and the Alexandria Historical Society, two organizations in Alexandria who promote and support Alexandria's vibrant African-American history. We hope that everyone has had a chance to screen the film, How the Monuments Came Down. This is the third film we have showcased from filmmakers Ayers and Lance Warren. In past years, we have screened their excellent film on lynching called An Outrage, and we have also screened The Hailstorm, John Dabney in Virginia, a film about an African-American chef in 19th century Richmond. Tonight, we are looking forward to reconnecting with the filmmakers and our panelists and exploring the film. Also, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Susan Piedmont Paladino, who is an architect and director of Virginia Tech's Washington Alexandria Architecture Center, also known as the WAC. Professor Piedmont Paladino has taught at Catholic University, the University of Maryland, and been a consulting curator at the National Building Museum. She also holds a Master of Architecture degree from Virginia Tech and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in the History of Art from the College of William and Mary. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Susan Piedmont Paladino.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I'm so happy I could be here. It's a real honor to moderate this conversation. My role will be to introduce our panelists and then sort of lead the discussion. And we'll just, and again, reminder, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I will be keeping an eye on that. So I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'll just go through them in one after another, and then we're going to go back to them and ask them to talk for just a few minutes about their connection to this topic, which is the topic of Confederate memorials. As Audrey said, we have the filmmakers, Ayers and Lance Warren, and they are Emmy award-winning, married documentary filmmakers whose production company, Field Studio, is based in Richmond, Virginia. They've collaborated as directors, producers, and editors on the film that we're going to talk about today, How the Monuments Came Down. Ayers and Warren's work also extends to other media, where they continue to highlight African-American history and struggle for social justice. We also have Dr. Lauranett Lee, who is a public historian specializing in teaching, advocating, and collaborating with diverse community and academic audiences. Lauranett is a full-time lecturer at the University of Richmond and is the historian for the Virginia Africana Associates and the former curator of African-American history at the Virginia Historical Society. She's the author of Making the American Dream Work, a cultural history of African-Americans in Hopewell, Virginia. And she consults with museums, churches, and community organizations and serves on several boards and commissions. And rounding out our panel is Eugene Thompson. Eugene is a native Alexandrian and was the first director of the Alexandria Black History Resource Center, which is now the Alexandria Black History Museum. He was the senior curator at the African American Museum in Philadelphia and the public art director for the city of Philadelphia. Eugene received his BA in history from Marquette University and also as a Master of Science in Education in Leadership in Museum Education from the Bank Street Graduate School of Education. And now what I'd like to do, Eugene, since we've finished with you, I'm going to start with you again and ask you to sort of talk a little bit about your connection to this topic. And I think we have a few images that we want to have up while you talk about this.
Well, as a native Alexandrian, I was also the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum, the first director of the Alexandria Black History Museum. And it's interesting because one of my first jobs at that time in 1987 was to try to figure out what to do with the Confederate memorial since someone had just crashed into it So 1987 to 1988, that was my first foray into working on Confederate memorials, as a matter of fact. In 2016, the city appointed me, along with 7 other people, to be a part of an ad hoc committee on Confederate statues and memorials, what to do with them. So we were charged with trying to figure what to do with the statue, what to do with streets, what to do with Jefferson Davis Highway, and to come up with a flag policy. So everything from there led to where we are now. There's a lot more to it that I'm sure you hear later on.
Thank you, Eugene. Those great images reminding us of what the intersection of Prince Street and South Washington used to look like. Lauranett, we'll go to you next and share a little bit about your connection to this topic. I think everyone here saw you in the film and got to listen to your thoughts about it, but go ahead and share a little bit of how you connect to this topic.
Thank you, Susan. I was one of the members on the Monument Memorial Commission, and I'm also a Virginian, having grown up in Chesterfield, that's just outside of Richmond. And so my experience with the monument has always been a part of my life. And as a Black female who studies Southern history with a focus on African-American women, the monuments have meant something very personal to me, because slavery was literally built on the backs of Black women. But I also understand what it feels like to have your history dismissed and degraded. And so I've been ambivalent for a little bit about how we should move forward on this.
Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing your thoughts as we move on tonight. And now, Lance and Hannah, can you talk a little bit about your work and how you came to this topic?
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you to the Alexandria Black History Museum for having us, indeed for having us back, as Audrey said. And it's an honor to be here with all of you and with Professor Lauranett Lee, who has taught us so much and whom we are humbled to count as a friend, and also with Eugene Thompson, who is someone we've not had the chance to work with, but clearly would also learn quite a bit from. We have indeed, as was said in the opening, been working at the intersection of history and social justice, and particularly African-American history, for over a decade now. And our connection to this topic in many ways comes both from that and that when the protests erupted here in Richmond last summer after the murder of George Floyd, they erupted on Monument Avenue. There was across the city, but Monument Avenue was a magnet for those protests. And Monument Avenue was also 3 blocks from where we were living at the time. Richmonders in general were subsumed by this, but we were very much right in the middle of it, about 4 or 5 blocks from the Lee Monument. We couldn't ignore this, and I like to think that we wouldn't have. And one thing that stuck out to us very clearly from the start was that there was quite understandably a lot of focus on the unprecedented scale and demands of the protests, but there was so much that was being missed, we worried, even by allies, about the history that had led us to this point. And we knew that as much as people were looking up to the monuments, we needed to look down to the people that had advocated to get rid of monuments, to redefine the city as not simply a memorial ground for the Confederacy for decades and generations. Most of those people were Black Richmonders, and those were the stories that we felt were essential to tell, so that indeed, as Lauranett nodded to, so that those histories weren't dismissed any longer.
We both grew up in Virginia. I grew up in Charlottesville, and monuments were certainly in the backdrop there, but very much in the backdrop at the time. There wasn't much discussion, at least in the circles that I was in, about removal. And it wasn't until we moved to Richmond in 2014 and really 2015 and afterwards that there was more discussion of what should these monuments do? What should we do with these monuments? And as Lance said, when the protests erupted last summer, we knew this was a time that we could kind of harness our understanding of history, but more importantly, harness all of the perspectives that we knew were in Richmond to kind of better understand Richmond from a descendant perspective or from a historian perspective, and really enrich the conversation around what these monuments mean.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I was struck watching the film that the title is How the Monuments Came Down, but there's so much about why and how they went up that gives us so much really different insight into what we've seen. And I want to start off the conversation here maybe by talking a little bit about storytelling and the power of that kind of narrative and the power of film. So we'll stick with you, Hannah and Lance, for a few minutes. You've talked a little bit about, again, how you're living where you were, that this story kind of was in your front yard. And as filmmakers, irresistible to sort of take it on. And also, it sounds like you see your filmmaking work as a form of advocacy. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about this conscious decision to use that medium and how film and art and other creative activities can help in these discussions about these extremely difficult issues and help us see even familiar things in a different light.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Susan. Before we came to filmmaking, one thing that we did, both of us, was work with teachers, especially history teachers across the country. Years ago, I worked for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, which any history social studies teacher will recognize as a major national nonprofit history education organization. And one thing that we both saw was the power of teachers, history teachers, social studies teachers, to define what Americans know about the past. You know, on so many topics, the last time that we may ever formally learn something about American history is 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade. And then maybe we go on and we don't major in history in college or go to graduate school for history. People go on and have their lives. And to the extent that they know something about the past, it may be rooted in that 10th grade lesson that is, you know, decades away. It became very clear to us that what is accomplished or missed in a classroom goes a long way to shaping the country that results. And at its best, that's an inspiring thing when teachers are doing really brilliant work. And with our 2017 film, An Outrage, we worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice effort, which works with 500,000 teachers across the country to put social justice history curricula in schools. And they took this 22-minute film that we had made about the history and legacy of lynching. They took this film and they wrote a curriculum for it, a sweeping curriculum that is adaptable to a variety of learning environments and state teaching standards that can be folded right in and teach a long ignored history of racial violence in our schools, where so many of us missed that history being taught. That, I think, in many ways, the experience of making that film and working with that organization, touring that film around the country, it showed us the potential to be a part of changing a conversation, to enlarge the frame that we use when we get in our minds what makes up American history. And certainly with regard to the monuments here, what was known most obviously is that they were there, that they were honoring Confederates. And there were a couple of lines that were quoted in newspaper articles last summer from the crusading journalist here, John Mitchell Jr., where he had a couple of quotes, saying that maybe those monuments weren't such a good idea. And that's about as deep as the historical consideration of the monuments was going at the time. We knew from people like Lauranett, from other colleagues of ours, that there was a longer, deeper, and more powerful history of Black resistance to white supremacy here, resistance to the monuments, one form of white supremacy, but resistance to all sorts of efforts to denigrate, diminish, and limit Black lives here. And so we thought perhaps in this moment, when people, way more people than usual, are saying that Black life, Black history matters, maybe they're only saying it for a minute. Maybe they're only going to say it on a yard sign. But maybe they'd be willing to listen to a bigger story about these monuments. The dominant narrative has never told the full story we knew, and that perhaps if we could take the opportunity of the moment to encourage a lot of people to listen to that bigger story, they might think differently about those monuments and about the city that has kept them standing.
And something else that we saw while touring An Outrage was just how differentiated our understandings of history can be from one another. Sometimes we would have a Q&A, and afterwards someone would come up to us and if the audience member were Black, they might say, you know, and this happened several times, you know, sometimes my family didn't want to talk about it, but eventually I learned that my great uncle was a victim of lynching. You know, stories have been passed down through families. A white audience member might come up to us and say, I have never heard this history before. And seeing that gulf of understanding and knowing that, you know, entities like the UDC and like state boards of education have crafted curricula in certain ways that have diminished certain histories, hidden certain histories. You know, we see film as a potential way to kind of help people come to a better common understanding. And I think one important way too is to share personal stories and family stories, because that's what people can connect with. So we see film as a medium where you can really do that, where you can hopefully generate empathy and demonstrate that these are real stories about real people.
And I think that question of how current events was led you back into history. That what's happening in front of us, we often say that we're watching history happening right in front of us. And I think in this case, sort of helping the audience to understand this didn't come out of nowhere, and to really understand the context. And Lauranett, that's sort of a perfect segue to sort of go to you, because talking about history, talking about public history, being a public historian, and sort of taking the lessons out of maybe the classrooms and the curricula into all sorts of realms. I'm sort of curious about your thoughts on this kind of storytelling and how we broaden audiences and how we introduce people to histories and find ways for them to understand that they might, like you said, after 8th grade, they might not be choosing to study history, but how do we learn history anyway? And again, your comments in the film were really, I'm going to quote you later on today, later on this evening, about one of your comments. But from the perspective of a public historian, how do you see the role of film in media and these kinds of messages?
Film gives us the opportunity to delve into the subject matter from a different perspective than reading about it from a text. You have every sense, almost every sense is involved in that undertaking. And so you're able, I think it opens up avenues to empathy better. And let me just mention this, when I think about outrage, and I remember meeting Kim Wilson, whose ancestor was John Mitchell, the editor, known as the fighting editor. She said that had gone to Charlotte County after there was a lynching there. My family comes from Charlotte County, and they left Charlotte almost immediately after that lynching to move to Chesterfield. And we never knew quite why they left. There are no words, no oral history that says it was because of this incident in particular, but that would be a reason Black people would move from an area and move to a better place. So film helps us see stories from different perspectives. It helps us understand what others might have gone through that we would otherwise not have considered, I think.
And Eugene, I'm sort of curious because of you've been involved in public art. So we're talking about public history and communications in public art. And if you have any thoughts on the role that art and creative production like film or sculpture. I mean, we're talking about public art when we're talking about these memorials and monuments, actually. What your thoughts are on the power of art to sort of introduce and change people's understanding of history.
It's kind of interesting because you always think that public art can heal a lot of people, but it can also cause a lot of controversy because not everybody agrees with that piece of public art. So when you're the public art administrator, you have to pay attention to all these various groups and have someone make that decision as to whether or not that public art truly should be in place. Fortunately, that's not the administrator, but a group of public art specialists. So it's a tough question, but I do look at Confederate statues, memorials as public art. They are art in public spaces, and there is a necessity sometimes to discuss that public art, whether we agree with it or not.
And let me jump in here and say, as a member of that Monument Avenue Commission, we had hoped that it would open up opportunity to discuss this public art and what this means, when it was erected, what was going on at the time, to provide context around it. In some ways that did happen through the listening sessions that we had, but we had hoped that it would be more long-lasting and sustainable.
Well, shifting Eugene, you had shown those images while you were speaking about Alexandria's own Appomattox statues. So shifting a little bit from Richmond to talk about Alexandria, you're an Alexandria native, and you wanted those up while you were talking. So I want to get you to talk a little bit more about Appomattox, about your feelings about that piece. It certainly seems that Alexandria had a different experience than Richmond did. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on why that's, although you did tell us that this has been a discussion for a long time, sometimes because of traffic safety, but that talk a little bit about that sculpture, that statue, and how it related to Alexandria.
Of course, this was a statue that was created in 1889, and it was created by the United Veterans of the Confederacy, with the assistance of the ladies of the Confederacy, who did the raising of all of the money for them, as they did with other sculptures throughout the country, as I noted in the documentary. The city decided that it wanted to decide whether or not to take that sculpture down. So it put together this committee, and of the 7 citizens, 5 of them are white, 2 of them African American. We had to make a decision. We had to listen to about 60 people over a 5-month period, 60 people and 150 comments. It was not an easy task to do because there were very robust discussions. And since Alexandria is very transparent, we had to do all of this in public. So it kind of inhibited some of the things that we had to say to each other on that panel. But it is a statue, as most people don't know, of a gentleman who is standing on a pedestal looking south and is inscribed with 100 names. The 100 names just happen to be Alexandrians who died in the Civil War. And when you're making a decision about what to do with that sculpture, there's this question: how many of those ancestors are still here? Would you like to have a sculpture, a memorial to your ancestor removed from the city of Alexandria? So those are just things we had to take into consideration. My personal opinion always came back to the fact that the sculpture had to be removed as respectfully as possible of those people who are still here in the city of Alexandria. The committee made I'm skipping a lot of stuff for the interest of time, but the city did make the committee did make a recommendation to the city. And that recommendation was to keep the sculpture in place with context, always context, to rename Jefferson Davis Highway, to not do a flag policy because we were no longer flying the Confederate flag, and to ask individual groups to come up with possibly the names of streets. Now, it's going to be a long process. Unfortunately, in August, the city did decide to do a pilot program on streets, on naming 3 streets. So we'll see what comes of that. The most interesting thing, though, is as I related to the documentary, was this new generation of activists, this new younger generation of activists, with the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. You saw those protests here in the city of Alexandria, and like in Richmond, but on a much smaller scale. But what I observed was those younger people, not only in front of the Charles Houston Recreation Center, but also as the students from what was then T.C. Williams High School would come into the city. So fortunately, the city legislature in 2019 did decide that we could take down the sculpture, and the Daughters of the Confederacy, in order to United Daughters of the Confederacy, in order to avoid any controversy or any demonstrations with the sculpture, decided to quietly take it down in June of 2020. So, and I think it was a good decision. It avoided a lot of, but it's finally down. So those are some of the good things that happened. Long story short, and there's a lot more to it.
But it is interesting. I think, every city is facing this in its own way. And of course, now when you cross the street, South Washington Street on Prince Street, it's a circle of asphalt. And I've talked to my students and I've said, it's hard for me to explain to you what was here. Because they're like, why are you pointing at the middle of the street? And it'd be interesting, again, staying on the topic of public art, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. I'm reminded of the fourth plinth strategy that they have in London at Trafalgar Square, which for those who aren't familiar, the fourth plinth is empty, which due to a lack of funds when they were putting up equestrian statues, they ran out of money. And so they have 3 plinths with statues and 1 with nothing. And I've often wondered, and this is Alexandria, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Richmond, and I'll bring Hannah and Lance in for this one. If we had kept the pedestal, and then, could we imagine from a public art perspective, something coming back to that intersection that's different, that tells a different story, that tells a more complex story? Maybe this isn't the forum to ask if Alexandria would want something like that. It again would be a traffic hazard, but
yes, I'm not sure. I hate to say this, but I have not been to that section since it was taken down on purpose. I just did not want to see it. I found no honor in the cause. So, well, I shouldn't say that, but I found no honor in the cause, so I saw no reason to go back. I would prefer just to see a space there and maybe on the side, put up the context, let people know what was there. But I think there should be some respectful observance of those people who did die.
When I had asked Hannah and Lance earlier, because I've not been to Richmond in a while and have not didn't get the chance to see any of this live, the complex situation that one of the pedestals, the one with Lee on it, because of the different ownership and different legal issues, that one is still standing. Is that correct? And it's still in the condition that it was. I wonder if you two could share what Monument Avenue looks like today.
Sure. So all of the pedestals are still standing, and of course Arthur Ashe is still standing with the monument overhead. But in terms of what Monument Avenue looks like, the 4 city-owned monuments, the pedestals are still there. The statues are in storage. The state-owned monument, the Lee Monument, the pedestal is also still there. It is surrounded by a fence. The city plans to remove all of their pedestals of the statues that they own, and to work on landscaping and similar to Alexandria, basically that any sense of there having been a monument would go away. The Lee Monument, on the other hand, there's no decision yet made on when the fencing is coming down, which a lot of community members are concerned about, because that space became such a space of gathering and reclamation last summer, and the state has had this fencing up since January, I believe, of this year. Despite the fact that the statue has been removed, that the fencing remains, and the pedestal the pedestal will remain until the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts issues a recommendation. They will be going through a process of community engagement to try to decide how Monument Avenue will be reimagined in the years to come.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see the condition that that's in, and I hope you're collecting all sorts of footage on that now, because it's interesting to think about, and in the film, the question about the difference between vandalism and art. and this sort of fine line that one person's desecration of a place is another person's creative expression, and seeing how this monument in particular was changed through projections, through annotation, through commentary, and through performance. And it seems to me a really interesting question, and maybe Lauranett, from your perspective as a Richmond resident, how could the city make a real place for this? Is this something, this is also history, and we're talking about preserving history.
Yes, the graffiti itself is artwork, but also not that the fence is artwork, but what does that fence say? What does it tell us? Who does it keep out? What is it there to do to protect that base, to protect people from hurting the base any further or themselves? What might the fence signify in this time of so much turmoil, but also fear? How can we look at the different ways that public art speaks to us and the ways that we can interact with it or not? There's a lot to unpack, not only in the graffiti itself, but the fact that that fence is there.
Yeah. The fence, who is it protecting? Why is it there? And yeah, it's a great question. And I think also, Eugene, you sort of mentioned earlier about renaming things, Alexandria City High School, and you're involved with, like you mentioned, with this project to really reconsider what things are named. And naming is power. In a sense, the naming of places, naming of streets. And so I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about it's the ad hoc committee that you're involved with on renaming. I'm trying to find the ad hoc advisory group committee on Confederate memorials and street names. And that's a project of the city of Alexandria.
It is a project of the city. And as I was saying earlier, I cut out a lot of stuff to say, but I did not say that. I meant to say that the committee was of 7 people, but 2 of them were African-American. And when the city submitted it, when we submitted our report, the 2 African-Americans dissented. We thought there should be a stronger conversation on renaming streets. And we wanted the city to make more of take a stronger stance. Now we knew it couldn't do anything because of the sculpture and the state would not allow us to do it. And my position was if the state is not going to allow us to do it, let's stop talking about it. Fortunately, to the city's credit, when it did accept the report, it and its state legislator made a request to the state, knowing that it would go nowhere. But and they also voted at that time to change the name of Jefferson Davis Highway. So there was a lot of controversy going on. There were a lot of robust discussions. And what amazed me most was not just that there were so many there were only about 15 African Americans out of about a total of 60. But what amazed me was how many young white people came to support the removal of that statue, not wanting their children to grow up with it, and the renaming of the streets. So I see that as a way of getting things changed. As you were talking about in the documentary, it is the power of the people that will get things changed. And I think that's what's going to happen eventually here in the city of Alexandria with that new generation of activists.
Well, we actually have a question in the chat, speaking of naming. Michael has a question wondering if the Wilson Bridge, the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, will eventually be named as part of this re-reckoning with Wilson's complex legacy. Eugene, I don't know if you have any insight into that. Certainly a major bridge, the jurisdictional complexities of that are probably enormous.
I am no longer involved in anything with the city of Alexandria with the renaming of anything, but I was wondering when that question would come up. Personal opinion, it should be changed. Okay, but I'm not involved in it in any way.
Yeah.
I think we're at a time now when everyone is beginning, most people who are thinking about the names that surround us. We see this happening at the universities. The University of Virginia heads a consortium called Universities Studying Slavery. And there are more than 80 universities who are included, but that doesn't mean that they're all the universities who are looking at the names of their buildings, names of the byways, and the endowments, everything. This is a time of great unearthing, of farrowing the field to move toward what America had said it wanted to be. We've been living with this ideal, this myth, and with the recent murders that have come to light, and these have been happening all the time, but now that they're coming to the fore, people are really beginning to see the depth of this injustice that people of color have been living with. And so I thank you, Hannah and Lance, for really doing this work and this particular documentary at this time. Thank you so much.
We're grateful for Lauranett for your support. And I think indeed, Susan, as you were nodding to earlier, some of the most powerful lines in the film, at least in my opinion, come from Lauranett, where she's really offering a frame for how to think about this history, what it meant that the monuments went up, what it meant that they stayed up, particularly in the face of segregation and in the face of resistance for so long. That's one thing we really wanted to focus on here, is how the monuments are not monuments in Richmond, just like monuments anywhere in the world, Alexandria, across Europe, wherever you want to think of it, they represent the people. They represent the people who put them up, certainly. And indeed, they often represent the people who maintain them and keep them up. For Richmonders, ultimately, that grew to be intolerable, that they would be supporting the maintenance of these statues. One thing that's remarkable to consider, Richmond is unlike Richmond, like other cities, has plenty of dissent about which way we should go about taxes and parking and zoning and all the things, right? But for a moment last summer, the idea of removing these monuments had such broad consensus that every single member of the city council voted in favor of removing the monuments. And that's a staggering fact. These are not people who are aligned on anything else, even the color of the sky or the color of the grass. You couldn't really get people to vote all the same. And again, that would resonate with any city across the country. But there was a moment when the only politically possible thing to say was that the monuments had to go. That comes from decades and generations of principally Black Richmonders fighting not only for removal of statues, which was certainly part of the fight, but for self-determination, for an equal opportunity to pursue life in Richmond, for an opportunity for Richmond to be a place where they and their children could call home and be proud of that and be satisfied with that. That is a fight that goes on, because even as the statues have been removed, as the point is made in the film, the many monuments to white supremacy remain. They remain in our schools. They remain in the gnawing presence of food insecurity. They remain in all sorts of ways that the city urgently needs to address. And I think that's the way in which this story about how the former capital of the Confederacy got rid of most of its Confederate monuments really is a national story, because it's a story of every city that's confronting, whether it be the taking down of statues or the renaming of a bridge or a highway. How do we go farther than that and actually remove the legacies and the monuments to white supremacy that allowed those statues and bridges and street names to go up in the first place?
Well, we have a couple of questions in the chat before I go on to slightly switch gears a little bit. And one of them gets, Helen sort of is asking really about that question. What do you think is the best way to engage with someone who says, when we're renaming streets or removing things, that we're erasing history? That's a classic response where you're just erasing history, and how will people ever know? So I'm sort of curious, Eugene, for example, if you got some pushback, and I imagine you did, about renaming things, that we're erasing history, and what's the best way to respond to someone to talk about that?
I'm going to pass that on to the historians.
Okay. Lauranett, do you have a?
Well, we cannot erase history. we can attempt to correct history. I think in particular about Shockoe Bottom, which was mentioned in the documentary, and Jackson Ward. Whole swaths of communities were wiped out. Burial ground was covered over. That was an attempt to erase history, but it was not erased. It's bubbling up now. The people are really bringing to the fore this history that had been dismissed by those in positions of power to rewrite history, but it wasn't erased. And now we're beginning to see, not even now, but before, we see the damage of trying to cover over a history. What does it do to a child to be in the classroom and hear that your history doesn't matter? That, and I say this having been in the 4th grade as the only Black child and getting to the chapter that talked about the slaves being happy, while at the same time we take field trips to Monument Avenue, to battlefields. What does that do to a child? Even now, when you look at the schools in Richmond and in so many urban places where they look like schools in war-torn countries, the restrooms are just, it's sad and depressing to children. Where you have police in schools, we see these vestiges of that dismissive attitude, that degrading kind of attitude. I think I've probably gone on a rant here, but what I'm saying is you cannot really erase history. You can try. You can put as much power and might behind it as you want, but that history will come out eventually.
What Lauranett is saying reminds me of, and I think one way that I often think about this question of erasing history, there was a time in this land that we now call America where people were unjustly killed in the street, where futures of many people were clouded and undercut, where many people who felt the agony of that were told by those in power, it's complicated, wait, we'll figure it out. And a revolt sprung up and statues started coming down. That's one way to describe the beginning of the American Revolution, when one of the first things that happens is the tearing down of a statue of King George in New York City. That history wasn't erased. We know that history quite well, actually. We learn it more all the time because of historians who are doing the work and thinking in ever more creative ways. Statues have come and gone from a landscape always in cities. It's dramatic to see so many leaving in such a short span of time as we are now. Virginia, as is asserted in the film, had more monuments to the Confederacy than any other state. That was true when the historian in the film says that, when we were filming that interview in July of 2020. It's no longer true because so many have come down in the last year, right? So it is startling and it's amazing to see that change happening on such a broad structural level. But it is in many ways just an acceleration of a process that has always been around. Statues coming and going as a community, as a people, redefines, as we're always redefining, who we are, what we value, and what we're going to celebrate in the public square.
And I think it's important to recognize all the ways that history is communicated, and the fact that some statues might come down. Well, if you only focus on that, then you're ignoring the ways that teachers are innovating in the classroom. You're ignoring the way that public historians are finding ways of intersecting with the public in new ways, and the ways museums are innovating. So, the way that we manifest history can and should change as technology allows, as we learn more and as we talk to each other and learn more of each other's stories.
And I think also that's why The Planet, which John Mitchell was the editor of, was so important in its time. When we consider when those monuments were erected, primarily between 1890 and the 1920s, that was also when Black people were being lynched regularly. Ida B. Wells was a journalist who really brought this to the fore. She and John Mitchell made sure that they used the pen as much as possible to let people know what was going on. It was also known as the nadir, the lowest point for Black people. That's a term that was coined by the historian Rayford Logan at Howard University. And when you consider what was going on, these lynchings that were happened and the erection of these monuments at the same time, it was not lost on Black people what those monuments meant. They knew that it wasn't about, it was more than honoring the dead. It was also about stay in your place. Stay in your place. And as much as possible, not only the journalists, but the activists then, the community activists, so many that we don't know all of their names, but they were pushing toward greater justice wherever they could. And that was a continual fight, resilience that they had during this time and now is something that's really remarkable.
We have a couple of questions in the chat that are somewhat related, and so I'm gonna, I think Deborah was one of them, and Paula asked some version of how do we get people to listen who aren't ready to hear? How do we get people who are ready to broaden their concept of what history is and who don't want to hear this, or who feel like they're being made to feel guilty for their role in it? I think that how do you convince people, Deborah asks, to accept history who are resistant to it? And that might be taking us back to the original question about the power of film and media and other ways of communicating. But that question of resistance to sort of changing the narrative and sort of rethinking history, to me, leads into sort of my next question, which has to do with the stories cities tell about themselves. And I think this comes up in the film very strongly. And Lauranett, you were talking about that period when the monuments were going up between the 1880s and the 1920s. We would use the term branding, right? The city of Richmond was engaged in a branding activity to sort of decide how they wanted to present themselves under the auspices of deciding that this is beautiful, that they're going to make this celebrated boulevard. And so there's this intersection of an aesthetic view of the city with a political agenda. And Richmond was trying to present itself as a certain kind of place. And that, of course, is changing. And I think, again, back to Hannah and Lance, you told that story really powerfully in the film, that there was, and I think from those of us from the urban design and architecture perspective, it's a sobering moment to hear that this street that people often hold up as a beautiful piece of American urbanism is, and I think there's a quote in the film about it, a grand boulevard of ongoing violence, that it's kind of a perversely beautiful street. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about how you discovered that kind of, that story and how important it was to tell that story, that the beauty of it is difficult.
I think it's compelling to me, the connection that you're making to this more familiar concept to us today of branding, and that Richmond's to brand itself in that way. But I think it's important to keep in mind that it was white Richmonders who sought to do that branding and tend to make it so. Richmond has always been a place where people of African descent lived, and until the most recent census figures had been a majority Black city for a very, very long time. And so I think that that's one thing as we think about kind of urban design and futures of cities is the dire need for involvement of representative group of people. I mean, that's one of the very many problems with the monuments, the lost cause monuments here. One of those problems is that they involved a small, unrepresented portion of the city making decisions. And so I think that is one thing that comes to mind, is that these were monuments that that glorified a minority opinion, frankly, and that we should think about the involvement of cross sections of our communities when putting up monuments, public art. That's one reason we made sure to include the story of the monument to Maggie Walker, which is discussed in the film, that had broad community engagement over a very long time, that had the engagement of descendants of Maggie Walker, who was a very important Black leader and business person here in Richmond, but also had the involvement of Richmonders from all walks of life. And so that is a sort of model, I think, going forward. And the process of establishing the memorial to Maggie Walker could not be more different from the process of putting up the Confederate monuments.
If there was a common refrain among a lot of white people before the conversation turned to removal of monuments, it was, well, they're just nice to look at, and they're pretty, and they're not really doing anything. And I think it was really critical for us to dig into that intentionality, that at no point were these just kind of, accidental, like, selections of who would be honored and where they would be installed. So digging into the very purposeful selection of connecting this to a street in order to attract wealthy homeowners, in order to give Richmond a sense of grandeur. All of that was connected, and that intentionality reminds me of something that an article that Audrey sent us about the Appomattox statue in Alexandria, that the United Confederate Veterans anticipated that there might be pushback later on, in years to come. And so at the same time that they installed that statue, they were petitioning to the Virginia House of Delegates to have a state law passed that would protect that statue. So just pointing again to the very intentional branding exercise that these monuments represented.
And I think you bring up this question of who gets to make that decision, not just in terms of who we define as public, multiple voices, but there's the complexity of, you might think of the stack of vertical governmental authorities. And in Richmond, that played out between the city and the state, and in Alexandria, really across the state of Virginia. And we did have a question in the chat from Karen, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it because it's very thoughtful. When the Virginia legislature, it just moved when the chat, when someone adds it moves, when the Virginia legislature let communities vote to remove their Confederate statues, many small rural counties voted to keep theirs. And the question she raises is, should the state have required removal rather than leave it to community choice? And here's this sort of difficult consistency. If we believe a community has the right to choose what stays or what goes, this makes it an uncomfortable thing. Or is it better, she continues, that the movement come from the grassroots of the community? And while the film is a story about Richmond, it's not just a story about Richmond. It's a story about this issue in miniature and at large scale in many communities. So Eugene, having been involved in committees with dissenting voices and affected by decisions at the state level and the city level, or Lauranett, how you weigh in on this, I'd be interested to hear if you have a thought on Karen's question about.
I do, actually. It's kind of interesting that communities were allowed their citizens to vote. There was not a vote here in the city of Alexandria. And except for city council, not saying to everybody, would you like to keep that Confederate statue? I'm not even sure, I think still in the city of Alexandria, knowing the makeup of it now, that it probably would have voted to remove the statue, again with those two words, context somewhere to talk about it. But I was just not aware that other areas had to vote. So I'm happy with what my city did.
Lauranett, did you have any thoughts on that?
It's interesting to think about this in terms of what we're going through at this moment, that clash between the state authorities and local authorities regarding masking in schools in particular. Who makes that decision for the good of the greater populace? Should it be the local communities, or should it be at the state level? And it's ironic for a state who believed in states' rights to either not make a decision or to make a decision. Who has that authority? That's an interesting and ironic conundrum that we're in now.
Yeah, and I think we're coming up on how quickly time passes, coming up on 8 o'clock. We still have so much to talk about. And I wanted to, Lauranett, I was struck by something you said in the film, and this sort of goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago. And I wrote the quote down. You said, "It's amazing what people choose to remember." And I would add, it's also amazing what people choose to ignore. And this gets back to, I think, Hannah and Lance, what you were saying about the people who wanted to just say, well, it's just a lovely street. I don't really notice them. I didn't know that was so-and-so. That's not meaningful to me, as a way to sort of dismiss that it has great significance to other people. And so I wonder if, Lauranett, did you want to talk a little bit more about it's amazing what people choose to remember, and that memory is in that sense a conscious choice culturally and individually?
Mm-hmm. I think Willie Dell in the film said something about when there was a majority in the Blacks in the legislature, that they didn't think about the monuments at that time because there were so many other important things that they had to take care of. And that doesn't mean that they didn't care about the monuments or that it wasn't on their minds, or when we look at priorities, that was not a priority. And so people might think, well, Black people really didn't care about the monuments. It's that we had more pressing concerns. And so when we look back and remember how all of this unfolded, our pressing concerns were truly pressing. We're talking about housing, education, food insecurity, healthcare, everything was just as pressing then as it is now. And so it is amazing what people choose to remember when we look at the history. Things matter to Black people as they matter to any other group of people. It's just a matter of priority, though.
And that symbolism, I mean, these are symbolic elements. And so this discussion about having to face pressing sort of life and death situations in a way, we'll deal with the symbols later, that you can easily misunderstand that reaction. Yeah.
Yes. And I don't think people ever really thought about how the institution of slavery was perpetuated.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned before, it was perpetuated on the backs of Black women. And it usually women are not considered. And then when you consider Black women of color, they are not considered at all when we look at our history. How do people remember Black women in the making of America? They don't think about it in this way, about slavery.
Well, and I think the other part of the story is the role that white women had in making sure that these monuments went up. I think that the gender side of this is really fascinating. We could almost have another entire program looking at the complexity and that sort of sense of the narrative of the Southern lady, which is really a complex story.
Yes. Caroline Janey spoke to that, and she mentioned how 3 associations really came together to raise the funding for the monuments. But this was happening all across the South and led by white women. And when we think about women's political power, we don't think about them in this way. But they were very powerful, not only in fundraising, but the textbooks, and really writing and funding the textbooks themselves. They were strategic, they were tactical, they were not what men thought of women as being.
And so much of that action in that period was before suffrage, before women had the vote even. So it's a different exercise of power. Really interesting topic.
If I could just add briefly to that, because I think it's actually a hopeful point on top of what Lauranett is saying. I'm just seeing Michael Johnson's comment in the chat that Michael would like to see a better push with teaching so that we teach a kind of a full history. Lauranett was one of many historians who were involved in recent updates, corrections to the Virginia Standards of Learning that are going into effect now that directly affect how Virginia students will learn about the history of their communities, of their state, of their nation. That is a powerful and important way to change, to move the needle on what people think of when they think of American history, what they think of when they think about the history of their communities. This is the work of generations. It's not going to change rapidly, but it is happening. It is happening through the work of people like Lauranett and others, people of conscience and who care and who are going to stick at this for a long time.
And I think also in the chat, Marcia is sort of challenging us, says we should meditate long and hard about the story Alexandria is telling about itself. And that's sort of a good lead in to what might be my final round of questioning before I see if any of you have any final comments, because unbelievably it's 8:05. Which is to get back to this question of the stories cities tell about themselves. And so Marcia's question is a really good one. The film is, like I said before, about Richmond, but it's about every city, and not just Southern cities. There's cities all across the country who are wrestling with their own images of themselves. And I guess I'll sort of toss this out. Obviously, May 25th, 2020, the day that George Floyd was killed, is a really pivotal day. It's a day that was commemorated this year and will be again, and will probably be marked for a long time, and a real inflection point where the conversation changed. And I think Hannah and Lance, you talked about how all of Richmond really changed its attitude and saw itself differently. And if you sort of look ahead, or maybe look at Richmond now, and this is a little bit of anthropomorphizing the city, when Richmond looks in the mirror at itself now, what does she see? Do you see her telling a different story about herself, about who she is as a city moving forward? And was that sort of part of your agenda for the film, is hold a mirror up and let Richmond see herself differently?
Certainly, we are committed to engaging a broad range of people. We interviewed 30 people for the film, I think actually 36, and 30 of whom are in the film. And it was important to us to have a diversity of age, certainly a diversity representing some of the ethnic diversity of Richmond. Latinx people are also a very large part of the city. They don't play a role in the film, didn't really kind of figure into the history in the as obvious of ways as white people and people of African descent did. But we wanted to reflect the diversity of Richmond in many ways, and ideologically as well. Not everybody was willing to talk. There are people on both sides who were discomforted by the idea of kind of putting their thoughts on camera. But that was one thing that was important to us, was that this sound like Richmond. And since those viewpoints are many and often collide with one another and don't speak in a clear voice, I'm not sure what Richmond sees when that Richmond looks in the mirror. I think, history we can look back and we can name eras and we can draw arcs and we can see, clear paths. But in the moment, I think the effort to find that clear path or that arc, it's like listening to a very, very staticky radio station where you can kind of hear that maybe there's a melody in the background, but you're not quite sure. I think we'd all be guessing right now what that melody line is in Richmond. History in the present is cacophonous and messy, and Richmond is in the middle of that messy process. And I could not have imagined that these monuments would come down last summer on May 24th. And so I feel certain that I can't imagine what the city will do from here, but I do hope, and I'm encouraged by recent results, that that moving forward will involve far more people, more representation of the community than it did the last time the city set about dealing with monuments.
You mentioned how you mentioned this inflection point last summer, and when we set about making the film, we decided we need to make this film and we need to make it fast, and we need to document this moment, not just what's happening on the streets, but document people's reactions to it right now. So we did all of the interviews, mostly in July, some in October, but everything that was swirling around was shaping how the interviewees were reacting and reflecting and thinking about what's next. And we're very purposefully in the film with this with Joseph Rogers talking about the statues coming down, but the monuments to white supremacy are still there, and kind of calling to action. This is a moment where it feels like change is really possible, but we have to see it through, and we have to think about what is important in terms of transforming the city in a real tangible way for people of all ages. And we have to seize on this moment and really dig deep into the things that are actually so ingrained that it's going to take a lot of time and effort to dig them out and to enact change.
It's great. And it's an extremely inspiring film. And I want to give Eugene and Lauranett a chance to actually make some concluding remarks also. Lauranett, I think you were about to say something because we're running up against time.
Concluding remarks. Okay.
One
of the things I thought about as I watched this was how Richmond tried to brand itself as a new city when it was still wanted to hold on to its past, how it marketed the Monument Avenue as a city that is rich in heritage and history and was willing to hold on to it, but still moving forward into this new South. I think in some ways it's still trying to do that and is conflicted about how to do that. Whereas before there was no pushback from anybody. No, I wouldn't say no pushback. There was no pushback from people of color that was noted by white people. Now, those who are in positions of power cannot deny that everybody, as much as possible, there needs to be a more diverse grouping sitting at the table when decisions are being made. There's no denial that needs to happen so that we do not repeat the past.
Eugene, some final thoughts. You talked about your optimism, seeing young people involved in pushing for change. Do you have any concluding thoughts about how we're going to tell hopefully different, better stories about ourselves?
I'm going to change just a little bit because very briefly, I did not really learn my history growing up here in the city of Alexandria. I knew nothing about that sculpture as I walked past it so many times. It was not until my junior year of college when I took a course on the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction that those streets came to life to me. And I say that only because I saw the question about somebody saying we should talk about the good and the bad. And I think reflecting upon what has gone on here in the city of Alexandria since I left my job as director of that museum, I see how the city has tried to talk about the good and the bad by bringing in people like the four of you who I just met this evening to talk about that history, which is something as a native Alexandrian, I really appreciate. And so thank you very much.
That was great. Well, unbelievably, we are pretty much at the end of our evening. I can't believe how quickly this went. We could take a break, come back and talk for another hour or two. And it also makes me want to watch the film again, and also want to go to your website, Field Studio website, and watch your other films. And I want to suggest that our audience here can exactly do that. They will be able to also watch the recording of this session, which will be available on the Alexandria Community Project website. And that they can go to the Field Studio website and watch the other films, and Outrage and The Hailstorm, which I'm going to do. And I also want to make a plug for a program that we're going to do in April with Audrey's museum and with the city of Alexandria and with the Northern Virginia Regional Commission and my school, Virginia Tech, to talk about spaces of remembrance and look at the landscape of the city, Duke Street, Freedom House, and talk about how the city can tell its story through the built environment and other ways of telling the good and the bad stories. And so with that, I want to thank all of you for this fascinating, inspiring, and illuminating discussion, and actually quite hopeful discussion, which was wonderful. And I want to thank our audience for their engagement and their questions and their thoughtfulness. And if I didn't get to answer people's questions, I hope we covered it. And it's a complex topic. And thank you, Audrey, for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Jim, for being behind the scenes and making sure all of this worked. I wish we were in person, and maybe next time we do one of these, we will be in person. That's what we're looking forward to in April, is that we can be in person. So again, thank you all so much. And with that, Audrey, did you have any concluding remarks you wanted to make?
I just wanted to thank everyone for participating tonight. Thank our panelists for a wonderful program, and thank you, Susan, for being a terrific moderator, and also extend our thanks to Jim Holloway, who handled our tech tonight. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon for another ACRP program, another Alexandria Historical Society program, and just wishing everyone health and safety for the rest of the year and the coming years. So thank you all for joining us.
All right, wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.